I read Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. This is a reread for me. It's the beginning of a fantasy trilogy, and I'm going to read all three books. So, as I go along, I will be spoiling each of the previous books, but I won't be spoiling anything this time. So, Shadow and Bone is kind of the story of Alina Starkov moving from girlhood into womanhood, I would say. That's like the broad symbolic stroke of the story, in my opinion. And basically, that happens with starting her off as an orphan, which happens in so much of fantasy and in the fairy tales that they come from. And then she moves into the royal court under the tutelage of kind of the strongest wizard in the land named the Darkling, who is basically the antagonist of the trilogy. And she is groomed by him to help him consolidate his power over the country as he tries to wrest political control away from the king, and the ways in which she resists him and eventually escapes him. So I think the world building and magic system in Shadow and Bone are top notch. They're a great example of modern fantasy. Bardugo has thought through the magic system, so it has all kinds of interesting, compelling, dramatic features without solving all of the problems easily and kind of introducing new wrinkles into the way that society works. She calls her wizards Grisha in this world, and they have various powers that seem to affect matter on the atomic level as guided by the kind of telekinetic powers of the Grisha. That might not be 100% right. I haven't read all of this series, but that's kind of the feeling that I get from the whole thing. And the magic system within the world is called like the small science, which I think is significant because there's a real tension between an emerging modernity and a more ancient culture of saints and supernatural idiom. And so when we start off the story in the orphanage, you have Alina and her best friend Mal are brought to a testing by some traveling Grisha who are looking for other people who have Grisha powers. And they test both of them, but Alina somehow resists the test and suppresses her abilities, and they don't find out that she's a Grisha. And so her and Mal grow up as peasant orphans in this society and are only found out later when they have to cross a magical zone of darkness called the Fold that's full of monsters called Volcra. So all of that right there in terms of world building is really unique and interesting. There's just a part of the world that is in perpetual night, and there's nobody living in there except for these supernatural monsters that it seems like the only food that they have are the people who cross. And you have to cross in relative silence, and you can't have any light at all, or the Volcra will come and attack you. A lot of fantasy is broken into this kind of like dichotomies of good and evil, light and darkness. And so I think Bardugo is leveraging those tropes to help us feel comfortable in her book, but introduce some ideas that she's going to kind of twist in unique ways the relationship between darkness and light. The Volcra end up attacking their ship, and they especially end up attacking Mal, who Alina at this point has grown romantic feelings for him because they seem like 17, 18 years old, something like that. And so she has this it's more than a crush. I want to say a crush, but it's more than that on Mal. And he gets attacked and she freaks out. And when she does, this burst of light and energy comes out of her and it repels all of the Volcra, and they run away from this magical light that she emits. And she passes out, and the next thing she knows, she is at the royal palace and being attended to by all of the Grisha, and she's being prepared to meet the Darkling. And so for me, there's, like the way that I read fantasy a lot, and I think this really fits into this pretty nicely, is that fantasy is better than any other genre at taking what is inside of a character's experience and pulling it out and building a whole world out of that the character has to kind of literally navigate through in order to kind of get over whatever, to grow through whatever the internal problem for the character is. More than any other genre, fantasy can tell this kind of story in ways that other genres just don't have the tools to do. Because kind of anything is possible in fantasy. And so what I mean by that in this particular case is that Alina has come into adulthood, which is confusing and full of turmoil. She has all of these feelings about herself, but feelings about Mal and other things in the world, about what she wants versus what she feels she deserves, and the ways in which those desires have been informed by her society. Like what she has been told over and over and over she is allowed to desire versus like what she actually desires, what she feels that she's allowed to become versus what she is capable of becoming. And kind of all the gaps in there create a lot of feelings of chaos, feelings of being lost. And this is exactly the way that she felt when she enters the fold at the beginning of the story. And it's full of dangerous monsters. This, entire entering into adulthood is emotionally treacherous. And so that is kind of brought forward in the story and literalized as a zone for her to move through. But we see right away that inside of her, she has the capacity, a unique capacity out of everyone else, to navigate that zone and to kind of like nullify all of that confusion and chaos. And then a lot of the rest of the story has to do, like I said, with examining Alina's desires and exploring what those mean for her and what she wants for herself versus what she feels she is allowed to have. And also having to grapple with what other people want her to be versus what she wants to be. And so one of the characters that we meet right away is a Grisha named Genya. And Genya has the power of it's basically like magical plastic surgery is how it seems to me. She could kind of like reshape a person's body to a certain degree in order to make that. I mean, the way that she uses it is to increase their beauty. And she herself is extremely beautiful. This is the thing that's most well known about her, and the thing that Alina notices about her immediately. And she uses her power especially for the benefit of the queen, who also resents Genya because the king is sexually abusing her, and the queen is jealous of her beauty. It's like a real Snow White kind of situation. And I think it highlights the way in which these wizards are incredibly powerful, the Grisha, but at the same time, they do not rule the society. The political powers in the world have dominance over the Grisha. And so even though the queen doesn't have magical powers, her resentment is a real danger to Genya. But in any case, I think the first thing that Alina encounters when she moves into this world of courtly life that contrasts so completely with her peasant upbringing is this, beauty that she is confronted with, is because the ways in which she feels about herself that she is not beautiful, that beauty is not something that she needs. It's something that she should not desire because she probably is not going to be able to get access to it. And so to want something that you can't have is going to create suffering in your life. And so for a peasant, there's no reason to desire to have beautiful clothes, to be beautiful, like in your skin and face and bone structure and on and on and on like that. These are inappropriate desires that Alina has been kind of like suppressing or not allowing herself to feel. And when she sees Genya at first, she kind of feels a kind of jealousy or a resentment, an anxiety that Genya is not going to like her because she's so beautiful while Alina is so plain, at least in her own mind, right? And so again, like all of these desires, these feelings, these thoughts are externalized into a person who can embody them so that the character can then grapple with these things. And I don't want to make too much out of this whole symbolic reading that I do. This is just how I read books, and especially fantasy. I'm not trying to say that like, oh, the whole thing is an allegory or a fable, blah, 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 blah. It's just that it's so clean and so good compared to what literature is capable of. If you tried to do this kind of growing up story from the female perspective in literature, everything would be more clumsy, I think, or less straightforward, less literal, and therefore less dramatic, less compelling, I think. You just have to like aim for different things in the other genres. Then fantasy gets to like get right in there and get dirty with it. So I'm saying it as a good thing and not as like the world is symbolic place and it's not literal and we shouldn't read it as literal. No, 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 no. I'm not saying that. We obviously should understand that Genya is her own person. She's not an extension of Alina. She has her own story, her own drama, and on like that. However, the story can be read in this way that I'm talking about symbolically, resting at a kind of another level, one layer deep in the book. And so that's where I tend to begin my analysis in this podcast. And then Alina meets the Darkling, who she is immediately attracted to. He's a beautiful man. He's dressed all in black. He has dark hair and eyes. He's young. And he comports himself with a lot of dignity and power. So he's never like yelling at people. He's never wheedling or begging. He's just always quietly ordering and fully expecting compliance with whatever he says. And we've already seen that she has these strong romantic feelings for Mal. And then immediately when she sees the Darkling, she's attracted to him. And I think this is really important in terms of Alina grappling with her desires, her kind of emerging sexual desires, and the way in which the story is actually deconstructing a kind of patriarchal relationship that Alina has been indoctrinated into. So in terms of like romance within the patriarchy, women have a kind of secondary position where the man will notice the woman, the man will be interested in the woman, and when he shows his interest in the woman, that is when she desires to be with him according to like the rules of patriarchy, right? And so a lot of times the way that this gets reinterpreted and dramatized in stories is that you have like the love at first sight kind of moment, or you have the way in which the characters only feel desire for each other, the man and the woman, the hero and the heroine. and they never have any romantic or sexual feelings for anybody else, or at least the woman isn't allowed to, right? And the reason for that is because it's following that patriarchal model. And so, even though the Darkling is the antagonist of the story, even though he represents a lot of danger, by Alina having a strong sexual reaction to him immediately, what this actually does is show that Alina's desires belong to herself and her body and are not a primary reaction to Mal and his intentions and his desires for her. In other words, she doesn't fit into the patriarchal model of love at first sight kind of desire. The Darkling is a viable romantic option for Alina. And because of that, it subverts the traditional patriarchal trope of a woman responding to a man's interest with her desire. And he also functions as one of the things that, this kind of desire, of course, is forbidden to Alina. She understands that she is in love with Mal and that she shouldn't feel this way, quote unquote, about someone else. And so she is kind of conflicted about that. But that kind of conflicted feeling folds right into the conflicted feelings that she has about the better food at the palace, the better clothing, the better treatment, the constant ability to bathe and use perfumes and makeup and things like that. So it's just one more aspect of a kind of lifestyle that seemed outside of the universe of possibilities for Alina when she was a peasant, and is not like some kind of unique, special, dark temptation, but instead like is kind of situated in a constellation of feelings and options that are available to Alina that she is not used to. And so the Darkling informs Alina that she is the sun summoner, who is a kind of mythological Grisha. Many of the categories of Grisha are well understood by everybody in the society. And so they can affect things like the wind and fire and material, like they can make clothes and things like that have special magical properties. Or you have, people who can affect biology, like healers, or like Genya, where she can affect, like plastic surgery type stuff. And the Darkling can manifest a presence of darkness. And then he's able to like hone that darkness into a kind of like blade that is the thickness of a single atom and therefore can slice through any material with no effort. So he's extremely dangerous, but it also shows the way in which darkness is not an absence in this story, it is a presence. Because usually light is the presence, that's how we think of it, and then darkness is merely the absence of light. And Alina's power, as we already know from the beginning of the story, is to manifest light. And so it would seem as if the dark power and the light power should be like closely related, but maybe not, because the darkness can manifest as its own substance or presence. And so the two of them might not be so much related as they are opposites, which again, like I said, is kind of typical for fantasy stories. At first, Alina denies that she has any powers. She's confused by the entire claim about her being a mythical, important person. And again, this is all kind of folded into, I think, an experience of, becoming a woman and all of the things that can afford you that seemed impossible when you were a child, but are desirable. But, desire is also scary because now that you have all these things, you have something to lose. And so her reaction to it is often denial throughout the early part of the story. She's like, I don't have powers. I don't deserve any of this. I shouldn't be here. There's some kind of mistake. But over and over, it's demonstrated to her that she does have this intrinsic connection to the light. And one of the big things that they have to overcome is the way in which she thinks of the light as being something separate from her that she is kind of calling up or commanding, rather than the light is her and her powers and her have no like difference. In the same way that you are your body, you are your mind, the Grisha is her powers. And this is like I keep coming back to that relationship between identity and power is an externalization of coming into adulthood, and the way that she has to practice and master being herself and getting out of her own way in terms of how she's thinking about who she should be rather than allowing herself to be who she is. That is a big part of becoming an adult. Children have ideas about what adults are, what they are capable of versus, what a child is capable of. And the big part of early adulthood is realizing that there is no fundamental difference between children and adults in that way. It's just the amount of power and experience that is afforded to someone is the main difference between adults and children in terms of like identity and all of that kind of stuff. And so she's given a teacher, a woman named Bagra, who is really, really hard on her, but kind of pushes her limits in a way that demonstrates to herself, to Alina's self, that there's no denying that she has this power, that she is extremely powerful, that she can master this thing, and that the things that seemed impossible, a week before, she's able to do, and Bagra keeps pushing her to do more and more. And the thing that everybody believes about the Sun Summoner is that they're going to have the power to destroy that zone of darkness called the Fold. And this is what the Darkling tells Alina as well, that he's going to help her with her power to one day save the world, basically, from this darkness and the monsters who live there. And so once she's mastered her powers enough to demonstrate them to the king, there's a big ceremony that happens. And right on the eve of this happening, the Darkling makes a romantic overture to her, and she's kind of swept up by it and confused. This whole time she's been writing letters to Mal, but he hasn't been responding to any of her letters. And it seems like he has forgotten that she exists, and this has made her very sad. But the friends that she's made among the Grisha and the better life of the palace has all like opened up new possibilities for her. And she is curious what life would be like, in terms of like she is desired by the Darkling. And maybe this wouldn't be so bad. Like he seems to want to save the world. It seems like he believes in her. He's very attractive. Like there's a lot of things about the situation that seem to be in favor of it. But then, right before the ceremony happens, Mal shows up with some of the army, and he gets to her, and they, by talking to each other, they come to realize that they've been writing to each other, but none of the letters have been transmitted at all, and that Mal has been ordered to track down this mythical stag who his bones or his antlers will be a kind of amplifier for Alina's magical powers and will allow her to like affect a much, much larger area with a much more radiant light than she's capable of without it. And that the Darkling has specifically been using him to track this thing down. And then at the same time, Bagra tells her that now that the stag has been located, she needs to tell Alina the truth about what's going on and that the Darkling is the one who created the fold in the first place hundreds of years ago. He's a kind of immortal creature of darkness, and that he has no intention of healing the fold. And in fact, he's going to use her powers to make it bigger and to kind of like enslave the kingdom and like displace the king. And so she tells Alina that she needs to leave in order to protect herself and to, get out of town, basically. And so her and Mal run away and they go off and rejoin the hunt for the stag that Mal was on so that she can get the boost in power that comes from the stag and then use that against the Darkling and thwart his plans. And while they're out there in the woods, there's a real contrast here in this part between the relationship that Alina and Mal have versus the way that the dynamic was between the Darkling and Alina, the kind of lifestyle that they have living as peasants on the road versus what was going on in the little palace, and all of the ways in which Alina feels far more comfortable around Mal and how everything feels more natural and just all around better, less confusing. Which, as much as the, palace is nice and everything, there's a real kind of false veneer to everything in terms of like the Grisha are forced to eat quote unquote peasant food, even though they don't live the lifestyle of the peasants. It's a kind of pretense to social equality that the Grisha make a gesture towards. But they don't do any hard labor. Their lives don't have the kind of precarity or lack of influence that the actual peasants have. Yeah. And not only does Alina kind of find it fake, but there's something like really insulting about the whole thing. And she is just much more comfortable while they're on the road. Like, as much as she misses the food and the baths and all that, it just feels like more authentic, at least. And her feelings for Mal make more sense to her than her feelings around the Darkling. And the ways in which, when she finds out who the Darkling really was, she feels foolish that she was tricked by him. And as they travel and they track the stag, they basically fall deeply in love with each other in a way that I don't think it was capable of happening between Alina and the Darkling. There would have always been this power dynamic there, this kind of manipulation happening, because the Darkling is not capable of the type of intimacy that Mal is. As capable as Mal is, and as confident and powerful of a hunter and warrior as Mal is, he's able to be far more vulnerable and authentic with Alina than the Darkling ever would be. And so I think this trip kind of clarifies something for Alina around her desires. Like I said, she has strong desires for romance and sex, but those are not directly tied to Mal. Instead, they are ways of connecting to Mal that belong to Alina herself and are not projections of Mal onto Alina in the same ways that the Darkling's manipulations were. And so the Darkling was kind of forcing her to assume the identity of the Sun Summoner and to become this kind of courtly presence. He was dressing her in particular outfits and particular colors, forcing her to go to events that she didn't want to do, and then seducing her and confusing her, and also keeping her out of contact with the people that she loved in terms of not sending her letters to Mal or allowing Mal's letters to get to her. And so just all around trying to control Alina, whereas everything is far more natural between her and Mal. And so they finally track down the stag, and Alina feels this supernatural connection to it, the way in which her power is going to connect to it. But because of that feeling of connection and also seeing its, kind of majestic living body, she doesn't want to kill it. She feels an empathy for it, this deep spiritual connection that she has to it. But then it's revealed that the Darkling has been tracking them this whole time so that he could get his hands on the stag, and he kills it and then removes its antlers and has them made by a Grisha who, controls like materials into an amplifier kind of necklace amulet situation that he has like a bracelet or something for. And it just literally like puts a slave collar on her basically in the form of this amplifier. And so even though this is giving her more power, it is actually empowering him. And so, like, I don't think the symbolic nature of this situation is very like obscure or anything. It's not like I'm blowing anybody's mind being like, this is a slave collar and he's controlling her. Like, that's explicit in the text. That's what's happening. And then he, because she now loves Mal more completely and he has confessed his love for her, that makes her vulnerable to Mal getting hurt and being used basically as leverage by the Darkling against her. And so the necklace kind of compels her obedience and allows him to control her light powers. But to fully kind of affirm his control over her, he threatens Mal, at every turn. And basically, they go back to the palace. They're imprisoned the whole way. And then a kind of diplomatic delegation is assembled of leaders and diplomats from the surrounding nations. And they're put on a ship and go into the fold again, like we did at the beginning of the story. And he channels Alina's powers to push away the monsters and keep the ship safe. And then when they get to the border of the place, he actually extends the zone of the fold even further to engulf an entire town. And all of its people are transformed into the Volcra monsters. And so that's kind of the origin of the monsters, is that they were the humans who lived there. And then this dark power turns them into these like dragon-like creatures. And during this whole thing, Alina is like trying to resist him, but she can't. And she is reluctant to fight against the Darkling because of what it will do to Mal. But then in this moment where the Darkling feels that his victory has been achieved and he has intimidated these other countries by showing them that if they don't obey him, then they are going to be, their countries will be destroyed by the fold. He feels that he doesn't need leverage over her anymore and he can punish Mal for defying him. And so he throws Mal off of the ship. And at this point, Alina realizes that because she did not kill the stag and she showed it mercy, she has a special connection to it that defies the kind of slave ownership relationship, that this is her power intrinsically and that she always had the ability to wield it herself, and it didn't have to be channeled through the Darkling. And so she takes the power away from him and jumps off the ship in order to save Mal from the monsters. And then the ship is destroyed and left in the fold. And the Darkling is kind of left defenseless again, in a surrounded by all of these Volcra monsters. And then Mal and Alina get out of the fold and they get on a ship and they cross the ocean to get away from their country. And so in a way, if you think about like the beginning of the story where they were crossing the fold and they were going to get to cross the ocean in the first place, the entire book is about them kind of getting to this place where they can cross the fold and then leave in order to kind of begin a life of their own. And so they escape the Darkling, but it's really only the beginning of the story because, he's still out there. The threat of the fold is still there. And he's an extremely powerful man who they have taken away what he desires. And so I'm sure he'll be back in the next book too. make things bad for them again. But I think there's something here kind of symbolically about the way in which the Darkling tries to control everything and the way in which Alina, when she's happiest, has to do with like a natural kind of getting out of the way of her feelings, a getting out of the way of who she believes she should be and allowing herself to be who she is. And also the connection that she had to the wild stag and the way in which, it's just out there in the woods, living its own life, having its own existence, owning itself, if you will. And then the Darkling comes along and destroys that while Alina respects it. And so the way that Bardugo is constructing good and evil here has to do with control versus trust, right? That Mal trusts Alina, the Darkling controls Alina. Alina learns to trust herself, the Darkling exerts control over her through the slave necklace. And so even the learning of how her powers work and moving into a space of mastery doesn't have to do so much with control as much of it does coming to a place of accepting herself and allowing her true, authentic self to literally shine forth. So, because when she was learning how to do the power with Bagra, every time she would kind of reach out to the light and try to wrestle it under control, it would never work. It was only when she kind of relaxed into the power and allowed it to well up within her that she was able to gain command over it. And so the entire book symbolically is about a kind of relaxing or releasing into adulthood rather than a kind of controlling of an anxious kind of energy of controlling everyone else into believing that you are an adult. The only one who really needs to be convinced that she is the sun summoner and an important person, a powerful person, a desirable person, and a fully grown woman is Alina herself. And once she believes that, everyone else will come to accept it, right? And that's kind of like where the moral core of the story rests, I think. And so in terms of like a coming of age story, it's unique, I think, in terms of like if you think of other things, other fantasy stories, they often have to do with like mastery and its relationship to control and the way, and this is especially true if the protagonist is a man, right? The way in which control has to be asserted and arrested from the enemy and then demonstrated through the mastery of the magical powers or the magical weapons or what have you. And that's not the case with Alina. Again and again, she is resisting against control. And it's only when she fully relaxes into the actual relationship with wildness of the stag and the personal feeling of like in that moment of having mercy for it, that she is able to stop being the slave of the Darkling. And so this story is, like I said, I think it's a really excellent example of modern fantasy, a finely built, secondary world. There's a really interesting relationship that it has to real life cultures around, the Eastern steppe and what we would call modern Russia nowadays, which is a unique kind of liminal space in our own Anglosphere culture for the place between Europe and China, if you will, and the kind of unique beliefs that they have. There's a whole thing here, I think, and I'll get more into it as the series goes, of Orthodox Russian Christianity and its relationship to saints and like I said, the small science and the tension between those things, because there's an evolving mastery of technology that's happening in all of the countries outside of the fold that is not progressing as well within the fold because of the Darkling's influence over the capital and the culture at large. He wants the Grisha to remain the most powerful element of the army because he controls that element, but also because the Grisha can be easily killed by things like, there's guns out there, there's repeating rifles, there's even machine guns, and who knows what else, like flying machines, who knows? There's all kinds of like steampunk type stuff just on the horizon out there. And all of that is more powerful than these kind of like telekinetic, atom controlling Grisha wizards. As powerful as they are, 100 people with guns would be able to take them out, let alone tanks, airplanes, bombs, and what have you. And so I think all of that is like an element of the world building that is speaking to this way in which Alina is immediately adopted by the church as a saint, and the kind of like relationship, like she goes to a mass. Like, what does that mean? Like, is there a Jesus in this world? It doesn't seem like that's happening, but it is very close to a kind of Russian Orthodox Christian tradition in that there are priests and there are saints and on like that. And the relationship that they have to guilt and martyrdom, that is a kind of unique feature of Christianity, I think. So there's a rich world here, a rich magic system, but all of it is constructed, I think, in order to focus in on the internal development of Alina and the direction that her story is going to take, and is not like a fully constructed world that has this story kind of crammed into it in a way that it doesn't fit. It feels very deliberate and very crafted and very masterful by Bardugo, the way that the entire story supports a certain idea of coming into adulthood, what womanhood means, and how it relates to the traditional kind of patriarchal tropes that we've encountered in other fantasy and fairy tales in the past.